Wyoming, January 1883. A girl lies barefoot in the snowdress, torn, bleeding, nearly dead. A man the size of a barn door steps out of the darkness. She opens her eyes. Pure terror. Shaking, she whispers the only thing she has left. "Please, I'm a virgin. Take anything. Just don't touch me." The giant cowboy goes still. Then he closes his eyes, slowly pulls off his coat, holds it out without touching her. You're safe. She doesn't know yet that the man who just saved her life is the only thing standing between her and the people who want her dead. Keep reading, because this is only the beginning. The Wyoming night had no mercy in it. Wind tore through the pine forest in long, furious gusts, bending the treetops and scattering dry snow off the branches like white smoke. The full moon hung fat and cold above the tree line, throwing sharp silver light across everything below. Beautiful in the way that dangerous things sometimes are. Bramwell Vance moved through it all without a sound. That was a skill you picked up fast out here. Make noise, and the forest stops talking to you. It closes up, goes still, and then you're blind. Bram had learned that lesson young, and he'd never forgotten it. He checked his trap lines the same way every night, steady, patient, reading the ground the way other men read a newspaper. He wasn't expecting trouble. He rarely did, and trouble still found him. He spotted the blood first, just a few drops, dark against the white snow, catching the moonlight in a way that made his stomach drop. He crouched, touched the snow beside it. Still warm. Recent. He scanned the tree line without standing, taking his time, letting his eyes do the work. More drops. A trail, jagged and erratic, veering between the pines, like whatever left it had been running blind. Then he saw the fabric. Scraps of it snagged on the thorns of a low brush. Heavy wool, the kind women wore in the deep cold, dark blue. He picked up a torn piece and turned it over in his gloved hand. Quality stitching. This wasn't trail gear. This was a woman's dress, a good one, and it had been ripped apart. He followed the trail. Every few yards there was more evidence. A smear of blood on tree bark, shoulder height. A small handprint in the snow where someone had fallen and pushed themselves back up. The stride pattern was short, unsteady, desperate. Whoever this was, they were running on fumes. Running on nothing but sheer animal will. Missed her. She was collapsed at the base of a wide pine, half buried in a drift of fresh snow. The moonlight caught the pale skin of her arms first, then the dark tangle of hair spread across the white ground. For one terrible second, Bram thought she was already gone. Then he saw the shallow, trembling rise of her chest. Alive, barely. He stepped closer, keeping his movements slow and deliberate the way you would with a spooked horse. She was young, 19, maybe 20 at the outside. Her dress, what was left of it, was a thin cotton shift, torn ragged by thorns, offering her almost nothing against the cold. Scratches covered her arms and shoulders, some of them still bleeding. Her lips had gone pale, almost blue. Her feet were bare in the snow. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved to the surrounding trees, scanning for threats. Then, back to her, he stepped forward and his boot crunched on an icy patch. Her eyes flew open. The sound that came out of her was pure, instinctive terror, a sharp, choked gasp. She scrambled backward against the pine trunk, clawing at the bark, trying to put distance between herself and the massive shadow standing over her. In the moonlight, Bram knew exactly what he looked like. 6.5 feet of hard muscle and rough edges, with a scarred jaw and a face that had never been described as gentle. His shadow swallowed her whole. Her eyes were wild, dark, frantic, darting across his face and his frame, trying to calculate, trying to find some way out. There was no way out, and she knew it. He could see the exact moment she understood that. Her chin lifted anyway. That caught him off guard, even terrified, half to death, even shaking so hard. He could see it. From where he stood, she lifted her chin. Her voice came out fractured and trembling, barely above a whisper, but she made herself say it, please. Her breath fogged in the frozen air. "I'm a virgin. Take anything. Just don't touch me." Something moved through Bram's chest, then not pity, exactly. Pity was soft and distant. This was sharper than that. Heavier. He didn't speak right away. He didn't move toward her. Instead, he closed his eyes. He reached up slowly, keeping his movements deliberate, and unbuttoned his heavy leather duster. It was a good coat. He'd paid 3 months' earnings for it, lined with wool, built for Wyoming winters. He shrugged it off his shoulders without opening his eyes and held it out toward her. Arm extended, face turned away. "Take it," he said. His voice came out low and rough, the way it always did. He hadn't talked to another person in weeks. "Put it on." She didn't move for a moment. He could hear her breathing, fast and ragged. "I'm not going to touch you," he said, still not looking. "Not now, not ever, unless you ask me to. That's not who I am." Another pause. Then he felt the coat leave his hand, the rustle of fabric, a sharp intake of breath when the warmth of it hit her skin. Then quiet. He opened his eyes. She had the coat wrapped around herself, swallowed up in it. The thing fell past her knees on him, and it reached her ankles on her. She was still shaking, still watching him with those dark, wary eyes, but her chin was still up. He appreciated that more than he could have explained. "My name is Bram Vance," he said. "I have a cabin about 1.5 miles east. Fire, hot water, food." He looked at her bare feet, then away. "Can you walk?" She glanced down at her own feet like she'd forgotten about them. She pulled one foot out of the snow, and he could see her wince. "I can manage." He doubted that, but he didn't say so. "All right," he said. He bent and lifted her. Anyway, scooping her up, the way you'd carry something fragile. One arm under her knees and one at her back. Easy and careful. She flinched and grabbed at his arm, a reflex. "I've got you," he said. "You're safe." She went rigid for a second. Then, by degrees, some of the tension went out of her. She was still cold, still shaking, still watching him like she wasn't entirely sure. But she let him carry her, and she kept her chin up the whole way through the trees. The wind howled around them. The moon moved behind a cloud and came back out again, washing the snow in silver. Bram walked steady and straight, keeping her shielded from the worst of the gusts with his body, picking his path carefully through the drifts. He didn't know her name yet, didn't know what had put her in those woods. In January, bleeding and barefoot and alone, didn't know who'd stripped her heavy dress away and left her to the cold. He would find all of that out. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting her warm. That was the cowboy code, boiled all the way down to its bones. You help the person in front of you. You don't ask what you're going to get out of it. You don't stop to calculate. You just do what's right, because it's right. And because the alternative is becoming the kind of man who walks past a woman freezing to death in the snow and sleeps fine afterward. Bram had known men like that. He'd worn a badge alongside a few of them. He'd taken that badge off and never looked back. He looked down at the girl in his arms. Her eyes had closed. Not unconscious, he could tell the difference. Just exhausted, trusting him, just barely, just enough. He pulled her a little closer against his chest and kept walking. The cabin light came through the trees. A few minutes later, a faint orange glow between the dark trunks. Bram moved toward it without hurrying. Steady. Patient. The same way he did everything out here. Whatever had happened to this girl, she was alive. She was warm now. She was going to stay that way. The rest could wait until morning. The cabin was small, and it was real. That was the first thing Evie noticed when Bram pushed the door open with his shoulder and carried her inside. No pretense to the place. No decoration put up for show. Just bare log walls chinked with clay. A stone fireplace that took up most of the south wall, a narrow bunk in the corner, a rough-hewn table with one chair and shelves lined with tin cans, dried herbs, and stacked rope. A man's space. A solitary man's space, stripped down to what was necessary and nothing more. The fire had burned low, but it was still going. The heat hit her like a wall. Evie hadn't realized how cold she truly was until the warmth touched her face and her eyes filled up without permission. She blinked it back hard. She would not cry in front of this stranger. She had cried enough tonight, alone in the dark, and that was done. Bram set her down in the single chair as carefully as he would set down something made of porcelain. He crouched in front of the fireplace without a word and began building the fire back up, adding 2 split logs from the pile beside the hearth, adjusting the damper with a practiced hand. Within a minute, the flames were climbing again, throwing orange light and real heat across the small room. He stood, moved to the shelf, pulled down a tin pot and a cloth sack of dried chamomile. "I'm going to make you something hot," he said, not looking at her. He was already filling the pot from a water barrel in the corner. "You drink tea?" "Yes," she said. Her voice still didn't sound like hers. Too thin, too scraped out. "Good." He hung the pot over the fire on an iron hook. Then he went to the bunk, pulled off the wool blanket folded at the foot of it, and walked it over to her. He draped it across her lap and stepped back to a respectful distance. "There are some clothes in the chest under the bunk," he said. "Bare buckskins. They'll be about 4 sizes too big, but they're clean and they're dry. Once the water's hot, I'll get you a basin and some soap. You can take all the time you need, Atsub." He moved toward the door. "I'll be right outside. You need anything, just call." She looked at him. The fire lit half his face and left the other half in shadow. The scar along his jaw caught the light, a pale line against the rough, dark beard. He was enormous. She'd known that from the moment she woke and found him standing over her. But inside the small cabin, it was more apparent. He had to duck slightly for the doorframe. His shoulders cleared it by about an inch on each side. He was also, she was beginning to understand, being extremely deliberate about where he stood and where he looked. "You don't have to stand outside in the cold," she said. "I don't mind cold," he said, and he went out and pulled the door shut behind him. Evie sat still for a moment, just breathing, just letting the heat work its way into her bones. Then she got up and found the chest he'd mentioned. The buckskins were soft from wear and clean, as he'd said. She found a linen undershirt, too, coarse but good. She stripped off the ruined shift. She didn't look at it, just folded it and set it aside. And by the time the water was steaming, she had washed herself as best she could with the basin and the rough bar of soap, cleaned the worst of the scratches with careful, stinging attention, and changed into his clothes. She had to roll the trouser legs 4 times. She tied the shirt in a knot at her waist just to keep from tripping on it. She opened the door. Bram was sitting on the porch step with his back to her, forearms resting on his knees, looking out at the dark tree line. He turned his head when he heard the door, took one quick look to confirm she was decent, and stood. "Tea's probably ready," he said. "It smells ready," she said. They went inside and she sat back down. He poured the tea into a tin mug and set it on the table in front of her, then pulled up an overturned crate for himself and sat at the far end of the table, leaving plenty of space between them. He poured his own mug and wrapped both hands around it. Evie drank. The tea was plain and slightly bitter, and the best thing she'd ever tasted. He didn't push her to talk, didn't ask questions. He just sat there, calm and quiet, drinking his tea and looking at the fire. Most men, in her experience, could not tolerate silence. They rushed to fill it. Bram seemed to have no such compulsion. He sat in it like a man who had made peace with being alone a long time ago. She found herself talking anyway. "My name is Genevieve Sterling," she said. "Evie." He nodded. "Bram, you told me already," he said. She almost smiled. "Almost. How far are we from Harlan Creek?" He considered it. 60 miles, give or take. 2 days' ride, in decent weather. I was supposed to arrive there 4 days ago. She wrapped both hands around the mug. "My father arranged it. We were coming from St. Louis with 2 wagons and 4 hired hands. My father had business there, land deeds, a silver contract." She paused. "The attack came on the 2nd morning. At first light," Bram's eyes moved to her face. Steady, attentive, but he didn't interrupt. "They killed everyone," she said. Her voice stayed level. She'd already broken down once tonight, in the snow. Alone. She didn't intend to do it again. "My father. Our hands. All of them. I hid under the supply wagon, and I watched it happen. And then I ran. I ran as far as I could before they caught up." Her jaw tightened. They took my dress to tie my hands. They left me in the snow while they argued about what to do with me next. But you got loose, Bram said. There was a rock under the snow, she said. Sharp edge. It took a long time. My hands were numb, and I couldn't feel what I was doing. But it worked. She met his eyes. I wasn't going to let them decide what happened to me. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite name. Not admiration exactly, more like recognition. He nodded slowly. No, he said. I don't suppose you were. The fire popped and settled. Outside, the wind had picked up again, howling under the eaves. Inside the cabin, it was warm and still, and almost for a moment, safe feeling. Evie set her mug down. She'd been carrying the next question since she'd walked back through that door, turning it over, trying to figure out how to ask it straight. Why didn't you? She said. He looked at her, waiting. You found me alone, she said. In the middle of nowhere, in the dark. No one would have known. No one would have come looking, she held his gaze. Why didn't you take advantage of that? He didn't look away, and he didn't look offended. He just thought about it for a second, the way a man thinks about a question that deserves a real answer. I'm a cowboy, he said, not a beast. He set his own mug down. Under this roof, you are a free woman with absolute autonomy over your own body. No one, not a ruthless outlaw, not a corrupt lawman, not any man breathing has the right to strip you of your human dignity. He said it plainly, the way you'd state a fact about geography or weather, not a speech. Just the truth, said out loud. I don't need a law written down somewhere to tell me that. I've known it since I was old enough to think straight. Evie looked at him for a long time. Not everyone operates that way, she said. No, he agreed. They don't. The men who attacked us certainly didn't. No, he said again. His voice had gone flat and quiet in a way that was more dangerous sounding than anger would have been. They didn't. She picked her mug back up. Were you always a bounty hunter? Something shifted in his face. Not much, but she caught it. No, he said. I was a deputy sheriff for 6 years, over in Cale County. What changed? He was quiet for a moment. Looked at the fire. The man I worked for, he said finally. The sheriff, I trusted him. Thought he was the straightest man I'd ever met. He paused. Turned out he was running protection for the Caulfield gang, taking payments. Looking the other way while people got robbed and hurt and worse. His jaw moved. When I figured it out and went to report it up the chain was rotten too. All the way up, so. You left. I left, he said. Came out here. Figured I could do more good operating outside a system that was designed to serve itself. He glanced at her. Bounty hunting's not pretty work. But at least I know whose side I'm on. Evie was quiet, thinking about that. Caulfield, she said. Red Jack Caulfield. His eyes sharpened. You know that name. The men who attacked our wagon, she said slowly. I heard them talking. One of them called the leader Red. She watched his face. Red Jack, that's who it was, wasn't it? Bram sat very still. Tell me everything you remember. She did. All of it. Every detail she'd held on to, through the cold and the running and the fear, because she was the daughter of a man who had taught her that details mattered, that you observed and you remembered, and you did not let the facts get away from you just because things were hard. By the time she finished, the fire had burned down to steady red coals, and the wind outside had quieted to a low moan. Bram was looking at the table. His big hands were flat on the wood still. Get some sleep, he said finally. Take the bunk. I'll sleep out here. That's your bunk. I've slept on worse than a floor. He stood, picking up both mugs and moving them to the shelf. We'll talk more in the morning. There's a lot to figure out. She could see that he meant it. All of it. The bunk, the floor, the morning. The figuring. She got up, crossed to the bunk, and lay down. The blanket was heavy and warm. The fire threw a low, steady light across the log ceiling. Bram, she said. He was settling onto the floor near the door, his back against the wall, his rifle across his knees. He looked over. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. Sleep, Evie. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 4 days, she did. She slept 12 hours straight. When she woke, Pale winter light was coming through the single small window beside the door, and the cabin smelled like wood smoke and something that turned out to be salt pork and cornmeal mush, sitting warm on the iron skillet at the edge of the fire. Bram was at the table, cleaning his rifle. He looked up when she stirred. "Morning," he said. "You made breakfast," she said. Her voice was still rough from sleep. "Didn't know what you could manage," he said. Figured plane was safe. She sat up, swung her legs over the edge of the bunk, and took stock of herself. Her feet were sore, scratched up and bruised from the forest floor. Her arms were stiff. The scratches along her shoulders pulled when she moved. But the fever she'd half expected hadn't come, and her hands were steady when she held them out and looked at them. Good enough. She ate everything in the skillet and drank 2 cups of strong black coffee. Bram ate his share without comment and went back to his rifle when he was done. She was watching him across the table when she thought of the journal. She went still. "My clothes," she said, "from last night. Where are they?" He nodded toward a shelf near the door. The torn shift sat folded there, and beside it the shredded remains of what had been her outer skirts. She crossed the room and picked up the shift first, felt along the inside seam near the hem with careful fingers. It was still there. The leather pouch was small, no bigger than her palm, stitched flush against the inner lining. Her father had put it there himself 6 days ago, before they'd left St. Louis. He'd done it without fanfare, just called her over, shown her where it was, and told her not to mention it to anyone. She unpicked the threads with her thumbnail. The pouch came free. Inside it, folded tight and wrapped in oilskin, was a leather-bound journal no bigger than a deck of cards. She turned around and Bram was watching her. "Sit down," she said. "I need to tell you something." He set the rifle down and folded his hands on the table. She sat across from him and laid the journal down between them. "My father was a careful man," she said. "He didn't trust easily. He'd spent the last 3 years building a trade network out of St. Louis, and 2 of those years were spent trying to acquire the deeds to a silver deposit in Harlan County." She touched the cover of the journal. "He found out 6 months ago that someone else had been trying to buy those same deeds out from under him. Someone with enough money and legal reach to make it difficult." "Who?" Bram said. She opened the journal to a page near the back. Her father's handwriting was small and precise, every entry dated and initialed. She turned it so Bram could read it. He read. She watched his face while he did. He was good at keeping it still, but not completely good. She saw his eyes stop moving twice, saw his jaw set. He looked up. "Judge Silas Sterling." He said, "My uncle," she said. The words sat there on the table between them like something dropped. Bram leaned back, looked at the ceiling for a second, then back at her. "Your own family." "My father's brother-in-law," she said. "My mother's brother. My mother died when I was 11. After that, Silas was the only family connection we had on her side." She kept her voice even. "My father never fully trusted him. He always said Silas had a politician's heart, too much ambition, and not enough conscience. But I didn't know it had come to this." She flipped to another page. "This is the entry from 10 days before we left. My father had received word through a freight associate that Silas had been making inquiries about the convoy route. He didn't know what it meant at the time. He wrote it down because he wrote everything down." Bram read that entry, too. "He didn't say anything." She turned to the final page with writing on it. The last entry her father had made, dated the evening before the attack. It was shorter than the others, just a few lines. But those lines named Red Jack Caulfield clearly, named the sum of money involved, and named the man who had arranged the payment. Bram read it and looked up at her. "Your father knew," he said. "He suspected," she said. "By the last night, I think he knew. But we were too far out to turn back, and the weather was turning, and She stopped. Reset. He didn't want to frighten me." Bram closed the journal and slid it back to her. "This is evidence," he said. "Real, written evidence in your father's own hand. Dated, detailed. I know, which means Silas knows it probably exists. And if he knows you survived, he knows I'm a loose end," she said. "Yes, I know that too." She tucked the journal back into the oilskin and set it on the table. Then she looked at Bram directly. "I need you to teach me to shoot," she said. He blinked. "Just once." "A Colt 45, she said, "and a hunting knife. I don't know how to use either, and I need to learn." She kept her eyes on his. "I am not going to sit in this cabin and wait for someone to come rescue me. I am not built that way, and I won't pretend to be. If we are going to do something about this, and we are, I need to be able to defend myself." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him taking stock of her. Not the way those outlaws had looked at her, not the cold, calculating sweep of men who saw a body and not a person. This was different. He was reading her the way he'd read the forest last night, looking for what was actually there. Whatever he found seemed to satisfy him. "All right," he said. She hadn't quite expected him to agree that quickly, all right. "You heard me." He pushed back from the table and stood. "Finish your coffee first." "Snow's hard-packed this morning. Decent footing. We'll start with the Colt." She looked at him. "You're not going to tell me it's too dangerous, or that a girl shouldn't?" "You just told me you cut yourself loose with a rock in the dark with your hands numb," he said, "and then you ran barefoot through a Wyoming pine forest in January." He picked up his hat from the peg by the door and settled it on his head. "I don't think dangerous is what's going to slow you down." She stood up and finished her coffee in 2 swallows. They went out into the cold white morning, and Bram set up targets on a split-rail fence at the far edge of the property. 3 tin cans and a square of burlap stretched over a wooden frame. He explained the Colt without condescension, weight distribution, the pull of the hammer, how to breathe, where to focus. He stood beside her and not behind her, and when he corrected her grip, he asked permission first, waited for her nod, and adjusted her hand for 2 seconds before stepping back. Her first 3 shots missed completely. Her 4th clipped the burlap frame. Her 7th hit the center of the burlap square dead on. Bram said nothing. He just picked up the 2nd tin can from the fence, walked it back 10 feet further, and set it down again. She hit it on the 3rd try. He looked at her. Something in his face had gone quiet and considering, the way it did when he was revising an assumption. "You've got a good eye," he said. "My father used to say the same thing," she said. "About numbers, about people, about most things." She lowered the Colt and looked at it. The weight of it had stopped feeling foreign somewhere around the 5th shot. He said, "Observation is the most important skill a person can have." "He was right," Bram said. "He was right about a lot of things." She handed the gun back carefully. "Handle first. I just wish he'd been wrong about Silas." Bram took the Colt and holstered it. He was quiet for a moment, looking out over the snow-covered tree line beyond the fence. "We can't stay here," he said. "If Silas sent Caulfield once, he'll send him again or come himself." "This cabin's going to get found, I know," she said. "The journal needs to get to someone with federal authority, someone outside Silas's reach. That means we have to move." He glanced at her. "You understand what that means. Traveling with me, through the pass, in January." "I understand," she said. "It's going to be hard." Harder than last night? He thought about that. The wind moved between them, cold and sharp, and Evie stood in it without flinching. "Fair point," he said. They went back inside, and Evie sat down with her father's journal, while Bram began pulling gear from the shelves and packing with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this many times. He moved quietly through the small space, checking supplies, wrapping provisions in oilskin, going through his ammunition with careful count. She watched him work, and she felt the grief in her chest solid, unmovable, but around it, she felt something else equally solid. Something built from rock and sharpened by everything that had happened in the last 4 days. She was going to see this through. She was going to carry her father's words all the way to someone who could act on them. And she was going to do it standing on her own 2 feet, with her eyes open for every mile of it. She opened the journal to the last page and read her father's final entry one more time. Then she closed it, tucked it safe, and she got up to help Bram pack. They had been at the cabin 3 more days when the sheriff came. Evie heard the horses first, two of them moving through the trees at a steady pace, no attempt at quiet. She was at the table cleaning the colt, the way Bram had shown her cylinder out, barrel wiped, each piece handled with attention when the sound reached her. She looked up. Bram was already at the window. He'd moved without a sound, which shouldn't have surprised her anymore, but still did. A man that large had no business being that quiet. He stood at the edge of the frame, looking out through the gap in the shutter, and whatever he saw made his shoulders pull back in a way she'd started to recognize. Not alarm exactly. Readiness. Sheriff Dodd, he said, low and flat, and one of his deputies. Evie set the colt down. The corrupt one? On Silas's payroll? Only sheriff in 60 miles, he said. So yes, she looked at the journal on the shelf, then at the colt on the table. What do we do? Bram stepped back from the window. We answer the door, he said, calmly. Let me lead. She stood up. All right. He looked at her. There was something in that look, not a warning, not a dismissal, more like a question. She held his gaze until he nodded and turned to open the door. Sheriff Dodd was heavy-set and red-faced from the cold, with a gray mustache and small eyes set too close together. He sat his horse with the particular ease of a man who believed his authority was built into the air around him. His deputy was younger, thinner, and kept his eyes moving in a way that made Evie think of a nervous dog. Dodd Knight looked at Bram. Then his gaze slid to Evie and stayed there, and it was not a good look. Calculating, proprietary, the look of a man adding up what he saw and deciding what use he could make of it. Vance, he said. His voice was the lazy, almost friendly kind that certain dangerous men cultivated carefully. Heard you had company. Word travels, Bram said. He stood in the doorway, filling it, and he didn't move aside to invite them in. Dodd's eyes hadn't left Evie. This her? The Sterling girl? Evie felt the shift in her own posture before she'd consciously decided on it. She stepped forward and slightly to the side, so that she was no longer behind Bram but beside him, visible and square-shouldered and looking directly at the sheriff. My name is Genevieve Sterling, she said. Yes. Dodd's small eyes moved between them. He made a show of pulling out a folded paper from his coat and opening it. Got a report, he said, from a concerned citizen. Says Bramwell Vance, former deputy, known to frequent these hills, was seen carrying off a young pioneer woman against her will. He paused for effect, looking at Bram. Kidnapping's a serious charge. Defiling a white pioneer girl, that's even more serious. The words sat there in the cold air. Bram said nothing. His face had gone very still. Dodd shifted in the saddle, and his expression became something approximating concern. It didn't fit his face well. Now, Miss Sterling, I want you to know you're safe. You can come with us right now. No one's going to blame you for whatever happened here. You were frightened. You were alone, Sheriff Dodd. Evie's voice came out clear and steady. She stepped past Bram and onto the top porch step, which put her at roughly eye level with Dodd on his horse. She looked at him directly. I'd like to know the name of the concerned citizen who filed that report. Dodd blinked. He hadn't expected that. That's not pertinent. It's entirely pertinent, she said, because the report is false. And a false report filed with the sheriff's office constitutes a crime in the territory of Wyoming. I know that because my father was a man of law and commerce, and he educated me accordingly. She folded her hands in front of her, unhurried. Mr. Vance did not kidnap me. He found me in his forest, bleeding and nearly frozen to death, and he carried me to shelter. He gave me his coat, his food, his bunk, and his protection. At no point did he touch me without my consent, coerce me in any way, or prevent me from leaving. She tilted her head slightly. In fact, he is the only man I have encountered in the last week who treated me as a person rather than an object to be managed. Dodd's face had gone from ruddy to a darker shade. The deputy was very still. Now Evie continued. I would like to address the specific language in your report. You said kidnapping, and she let the pause breathe defiling. Those are criminal charges, Sheriff. To bring those charges against a man without evidence, without witness testimony, Without the sworn statement of the alleged victim, who is standing right here, in front of you, telling you clearly that nothing of the kind occurred that is called false accusation. And it exposes the person who made the report and the officer of the law who acted on it without due diligence to serious legal liability. She looked at him steadily. Is that something you'd like to explain to a federal circuit judge? Dodd stared at her. His jaw had tightened. The lazy friendliness was gone now, and what was under it wasn't much better. He looked at Bram. She always talked like this? Yes, Bram said. There was something in his voice that might, in another context, have been the beginning of a smile. I need to ask you some questions, Miss Sterling, about your wagon party. I have already given my account to Mr. Vance, she said. When I am ready to make a formal statement, I will do so before a federal marshal, not a county sheriff, whose jurisdiction in this matter I have reason to question. She held his gaze. Is there anything else, Sheriff? The silence stretched out. The deputy's horse moved sideways a few steps, and the deputy pulled it back without looking away from Evie. Dodd rolled up the paper slowly and tucked it back in his coat. When he looked at her again, the friendly performance was completely gone. What was left was something flat and cold and quietly threatening. You'd do well to come into town, Miss Sterling, he said, for your own protection. I appreciate your concern, she said. Good day, Sheriff. He held her gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he turned his horse, and his deputy followed, and they went back the way they'd come, through the trees, and didn't look back. Evie stood on the porch step until the sound of hooves faded completely. Then she let out a long, controlled breath. Bram was looking at her. You want to tell me where that came from? He said. My father argued 3 commercial cases before the St. Louis Circuit Court, she said. I attended every one. She turned and went back inside. We need to leave today, don't we? He followed her in. Before nightfall, she was already moving toward the shelf where her gear was laid out. Then let's go. She didn't look back at the cabin as they rode out. She kept her eyes forward on the white trail ahead and the gray sky pressing down through the pines. But she was aware of it behind her, the warmth it had been, the fire and the chamomile tea, and the first safety she'd felt since St. Louis. Bram rode beside her on his big gray gelding. He'd given her the smaller roan mare, sure-footed and calm, with a gait that was easy to sit, even for someone who'd spent more years in city parlors than in saddles. He didn't push the pace, steady and deliberate, same as everything else he did. They were 3 miles out when he said, You defended me. She glanced over. You were being falsely accused. I know, he said. Most people in your position would have been glad to let it happen. Made things easier for them. She looked at him for a moment. This massive, quiet man on his gray horse, picking his way through the snow with calm, unhurried attention. You haven't made things easier for yourself since the moment you found me, she said. That matters. He didn't answer, but something in his posture shifted, subtle and brief, the way it did when something landed, that he hadn't quite been prepared for. They rode on toward the White Rock Pass. The pass announced itself 2 hours before they reached it. The trees thinned, the trail narrowed. The rock walls rose up on either side in sheer, dark faces slick with ice, and the wind changed character entirely. It stopped moving through things and started driving at them, hard and direct, carrying snow that wasn't falling from the but being lifted off the ground and hurled sideways. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes. Bram pulled his horse up and studied the trail ahead. The pass cut through a ridge in a long diagonal, maybe a 1/4 mile of narrow path with a cliff wall on the left and a canyon drop on the right. In good weather, it was a 2-hour crossing. In weather like this, it was something else. How bad? Evie asked. She'd pulled her scarf up over the lower half of her face, and her breath was fogging in the gap above it. Bad enough, he said. He scanned the ridge lines, the rock faces, the blind curves in the path ahead. But it's the only pass for 30 miles in either direction. Going around adds 2 days. And Dodd knows we're moving. Yes, he said, he does. She looked at the pass, at the gray sky pressing down above the rock walls, heavy with more weather coming. She looked at Bram. "Then we go through," she said. He looked at her a moment. Then he clicked his horse forward. They moved into the pass single file. Bram ahead, Evie close behind. The path was wide enough for one horse, with care on each side, no more. To the right, the canyon fell away into gray, nothing, the bottom invisible in the blowing snow. Evie kept her eyes on Bram's back and her mare's head and the trail directly in front of them, and she didn't look right. The wind was deafening in the narrow passage. It came off the cliff wall and bounced back, so it seemed to hit from every direction at once. The horses moved with their heads down, ears flat. They were halfway through when Bram stopped. He stopped so suddenly that Evie's mare almost walked into the hindquarters of his gelding. He held up one hand, flat without turning around. She stopped, held her breath. She heard it then, underneath the wind. The wrong sound, not rock or ice. Movement. The soft, deliberate movement of men who were trying not to make noise. They were coming from the far end of the pass. From both sides of the trail, she realized the ledge above and the path ahead. She couldn't see them yet, but she could feel them. The way the air in the pass had changed. The way her mare's ears had gone forward and sharp. Bram turned his head just enough to speak to her over his shoulder. "Behind me," he said. Quiet and direct. Tight. She moved her mare up close. Then they came. 5 of them. They materialized out of the blowing snow like shapes, stepped out of a bad dream, 2 from the ledge above, rappelling down on ropes with the practiced ease of men who had done it before, and 3 on horseback, blocking the trail ahead. They were dressed for weather and armed for serious work, rifles out and ready. The one in the lead had red hair under his hat. Even in the blowing snow, even from 30 feet away, the color was unmistakable. Red Jack Caulfield. He was not what Evie had expected. The men who'd attacked the wagon had been rough and loud. Caulfield was quiet. He sat his horse with stillness, looking at them across the narrow pass, and his expression was almost pleasant, which was worse than anger would have been. "Vance," he said. His voice carried clean through the wind. "Didn't figure on seeing you out here, Caulfield." Bram's voice was level. "Can't say the same." Caulfield's gaze moved to Evie. "Miss Sterling, your uncle sends his regards." "My uncle," Evie said, "is going to hang." Caulfield smiled. It didn't reach anything above his mouth. "Not if you're not around to say so." He looked back at Bram. "Step aside. Girl comes with us. You ride out of this pass and forget you ever saw her." "You can do that." "No," Bram said. "I can't." Caulfield nodded slowly, the way people nod when they get the answer they expected. He raised one hand. Everything happened in pieces after that, rapid and disjointed, the way violence always unfolds, not like a story, but like shattered glass, each fragment sharp and separate. The 2 men from the ledge hit the trail behind Evie. The 3 on horseback ahead began to advance. Bram's gun was in his hand before Evie had processed the men dropping down, and the canyon cracked open with the sound of it. 1 shot, then 2, deafening in the narrow rock walls. One of the advancing horses shied. A man shouted. Bram wheeled his gelding sideways across the trail, putting himself between Evie and the men ahead. "Ride!" he shouted at her, left behind the shelf. A shot rang out from the ledge above. Then another. Bram lurched in the saddle. It was a small movement, but Evie saw it. A flinch and a pull, the kind a body makes when something hits it wrong. He straightened immediately. "Kept firing," he shouted. She kicked the mare hard. The horse lunged left, toward the rock shelf. He'd indicated a natural outcrop in the cliff wall, deep enough to stand a horse in sideways. The mare scrambled for footing on the icy path, and Evie held on, and they made it, crashing into the shelter of the rock. From inside the crevice, she could see the trail. The world outside had become chaos, gunshots, and shouting, and the screaming of at least one horse, the wind tearing through all of it, and throwing snow sideways in dense curtains that cut visibility to 20 feet. Bram was still on the trail. He'd dismounted. His gelding had bolted. She couldn't see where. He was on foot in the middle of the pass, a massive dark shape in the blowing white, and he was bleeding. She could see it even from here. His left side low on the ribs, dark and spreading through the sheepskin coat, with the ugly patience of a serious wound. He was still firing. 2 of the 5 men were down. One had his horse under control and was wheeling for another pass. Caulfield was pulling back to the far end of the trail, regrouping, shouting orders she couldn't hear over the wind. The 2 men who'd dropped from the ledge were advancing on foot from behind, moving carefully up the narrow path, using the rock wall for cover. Bram fired at them once, and they pulled back. He was buying time, buying it with his body, standing out there in the open and bleeding into the snow, between her and everyone who was coming. She pressed herself back against the cold rock, her hands shaking, but her mind suddenly, sharply clear. He had shoved her somewhere safe. He was out there alone, bleeding, facing 5 men. He had 4 shots left in the cylinder. She knew because she'd helped him count ammunition that morning. The 2 men from behind rounded a bump in the rock wall, and Bram swung to face them and fired once more. One of them went down, the other retreated. 3 shots. Then one of the horses ahead lunged forward through the snow, and the rider fired, and Bram took the hit. This time it wasn't a flinch. His whole body staggered. He went down to one knee in the snow, gun still up, and the sound he made was raw and deep and furious, more animal than human. He pushed himself back upright through pure grinding will. 2 shots left. The blizzard closed in like a curtain being drawn. Through it, she could see his silhouette massive and dark and swaying and still upright, and the shapes of the advancing men. She could hear the thundering crack of his gun again. Once, twice, she could hear him roar, wordless and savage, into the wind. She could see the silhouettes of men falling back, confused and scared, and she thought she would think afterward that whatever they'd expected when Silas Sterling hired them to tie up a loose end, it had not been this. It had not been Bramwell Vance. His silhouette wavered, seemed to hold for one long moment against the white storm, as if the size of him alone was enough to defy gravity. Then he went down. He collapsed forward into the snow, and the red spread out beneath him, and the pass went quiet, except for the screaming wind. Evie couldn't breathe. She sat frozen in the rock crevice with her back against the cliff wall and her mare trembling beside her and her mind trying to process what her eyes had just shown her. Somewhere in the storm she could hear Caulfield's voice, distant and muffled, pulling his remaining men back. Retreating, waiting out the weather, regrouping, not sure what was still standing out there in the blizzard. She had minutes, maybe less. She looked down at the Colt in her hand. She hadn't even registered drawing it. Her grip on it was white-knuckled and steady. She heard boots on the trail. One of the remaining men, creeping up from behind, using the snow for cover, moving toward Bram's body. She steadied her breathing. She thought about the tin can on the fence rail. She thought about what Bram had said. "You've got a good eye." She stepped out from the shelter of the rock. The man was 15 feet away. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. And his gun came up, and so did hers, and she fired first. He went down. The canyon swallowed the echo of the shot, and the wind filled in behind it. And then there was nothing moving on the trail. Evie walked out into the storm, to where Bram had fallen, and she dropped to her knees in the red snow beside him and pressed her hand against the wound, and he was still warm, and he was still breathing. "Don't you dare," she said. Her voice cracked on it, sharp and furious. "Don't you dare." He didn't answer, but under her hand she felt his chest rise. She was going to need to move him. 250 pounds of unconscious cowboy on an icy mountain trail in a blizzard alone. She looked at the cliff walls around her and the dark sky above and the blood-stained snow under her knees, and she made a decision. She stood up. She got her mare. She found a sheltered alcove in the rock wall, 30 feet off the main trail, hidden from view. She got her rope. She got her hands under Bram's arms, and she pulled inch by inch, digging her boots into the ice and throwing everything she had into every inch of it. She didn't think about whether she could do it. She had already determined that she was going to, and that left no room for the other question. Inch by inch, she pulled him in out of the storm. The cave was 15 feet deep and smelled of wet rock and old ash. Someone had sheltered here before. Years back, there was a ring of blackened stones in the center of the floor and a small stack of wood against the far wall, dry and forgotten. Evie didn't question it. She just thanked whatever drifter or trapper had left it there and got to work. Getting Bram inside had taken everything she had. She'd looped the rope under his arms and across her shoulders and used the wall of the cliff for leverage, bracing her boots against any crack and bump in the rock face she could find, and she'd moved him one grinding foot at a time. The ice worked against her. His weight worked against her. The wind worked against her. None of that was relevant. She'd kept pulling, and she hadn't let herself think about anything except the next foot of ground. When she finally got him fully inside the cave, she sat on the floor beside him. For 30 seconds, hands braced on her knees, breathing hard. Then she stood back up, fire first. She built it the way Bram had shown her, starting with the dry bark from the bottom of the woodpile, building up in a pyramid, keeping the structure loose enough for air to move through it. Her hands were shaking from cold and exertion, and something more than that, but she kept them steady by paying attention to the task in front of her, and nothing else. The fire caught on the third attempt. She fed it carefully until it was stable and throwing real heat into the cave. Then she turned to Bram. She'd never done anything like what she was about to do. She knew that, and she didn't dwell on it. What she did know came from two sources. The first was a medical text she'd read at 14. Her father's library had been wide and unsupervised, and she'd consumed most of it without prejudice. The second was watching the wagon train's hired hand, a former army man named Reese, dress a bullet graze on the second day of their journey. She'd watched carefully because she always watched carefully. She went through the saddlebag she'd managed to drag in with them. She found the whiskey first, half a bottle. Bram's small tin of medical supplies needle, thread, a folded square of clean linen, her own spare shirt, which she could cut into strips, a hunting knife with a clean blade. She looked at Bram's face in the firelight. His color was bad. His breathing was shallow but regular, with no wet sound to it, which she took to mean the lung wasn't hit. The entry wound was low on his left ribs, slightly toward the back. She worked his coat off carefully, and his shirt beneath it, and she looked at the wound with clear, unblinking attention. There was an exit wound. That was good. The bullet had gone through. She knew what she still had to do. The wound needed to be cleaned, front and back. Debris, picked out, packed, and stitched closed. She knew what that involved, and she didn't think about Bram's pain or her own inexperience. She thought about the steps, in order, and she did them. She held the blade of the hunting knife in the fire for a long count, poured whiskey over her hands, over the linen, over the wound. Bram flinched hard, and his breath went sharp through his teeth, but he didn't wake. She worked quickly, and as carefully as her hands would allow, cleaning and checking the wound, removing a fragment of coat lining that had been pushed in with the bullet. Then she soaked the linen in whiskey and packed both openings. The stitching was the part she had to slow down for. She'd practiced fine needlework since she was 6 years old. Sampler stitches, her aunt had called them, and Evie had always found them tedious. She did not find this tedious. She found it the most important thing she had ever done in her life. And she worked each stitch with the same focus she'd given every problem that had ever mattered to her, tight and even. No wasted movement. When it was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at it. It wasn't beautiful work, but it was closed and clean, and it would hold. She wrapped his torso with strips from her spare shirt, firm but not restricting. She got the blanket from the saddlebag and spread it over him. She built the fire up another notch, and then she sat beside him on the cave floor, her back against the rock wall, and she watched his chest rise and fall. Outside, the blizzard was screaming through the pass. In here, it was almost warm. She didn't let herself fall asleep. She didn't trust herself to wake fast enough if something changed his breathing. the fire, any sound from outside the cave. So she stayed up and she watched him, and she kept the fire going. And every time her eyes tried to close, she thought about Red Jack Caulfield retreating through the snow and getting his men reorganized, and the fact that morning would come, and she would need to be ready for it. Around what she guessed was 3 in the morning, Bram's fever spiked. She felt it when she pressed the back of her hand to his forehead to check. He was burning. His face had gone tight and strained even in unconsciousness, and he'd started to shiver despite the blanket and the fire. She did what she could. She melted snow in the tin cup over the fire and used the clean corner of the linen to wet his face and neck, cooling him down by degrees. She kept his torso covered. She talked to him quietly while she worked, not because she thought he could hear her, but because the silence in the cave, between the howls of wind outside, was too heavy to sit in without something to push back against it. "Stay with me," she told him. "You are not allowed to die in a cave. That's not how this ends." She wrung out the cloth and applied it again to his neck. "I didn't drag 250 pounds of stubborn cowboy across an icy mountain path so you could give up on me now." He didn't respond. His breathing stayed shallow and labored, but it stayed. She worked through the rest of the night. The fever didn't break until just before dawn. It receded slowly, the way bad things often do, giving up ground reluctantly and in stages. By the time gray light was leaking into the cave entrance, his forehead had cooled, and his breathing had eased, and the lines of pain had smoothed off his face. Evie sat beside him in the early light and looked at her hands. They were a mess, scraped and bruised from pulling him across the rock, stained dark with dried blood. His blood cracked from the cold and the repeated soaking in whiskey. She turned them over and looked at them both sides, and then she curled them into her lap. Her father had given her piano lessons at 8 years old, and she'd hated every minute of them. She had not, at any point in her life, imagined using her hands for this. She heard the sound at the cave entrance, and her head came up, the Colt already in her hand, before her mind had fully caught up. She pointed it at the entrance, steadied her breathing, and waited. A shape appeared, dark against the gray light, low and cautious, moving in 4-legged increments. It was Bram's gray gelding. The horse had found its way back in the night. It stood at the cave entrance, steam rising from its nostrils, looking at her with large, quiet eyes. After a moment, it pushed further in out of the cold, stepping carefully, and lowered its head to sniff at Bram's hand. Evie lowered the colt. "Good horse," she said. Her voice came out rough. She cleared her throat. "Good horse. Come in out of the cold." She got up and checked the gelding over no serious injuries, some scraping on his flanks from scrambling on ice. She tied him loosely to a rock spur inside the cave and gave him water from melted snow. Then she sat back down beside Bram and waited for him to wake up. He woke in the mid-morning. She was feeding the fire when she heard the change in his breathing, a deeper pull of air, a shift of weight on the cave floor. She turned around. He was looking at her. His eyes were open, glassy, and slightly unfocused from the fever and the blood loss, but open and tracking. He looked at her face, then at the cave ceiling, then back at her. His mouth moved. She leaned closer. "You stitched me," he said. His voice was barely there. "I did," she said. He was quiet for a moment, processing. "I'm in a cave." "Yes, you moved me." "I did." Another silence. He seemed to be taking inventory of his body, checking what worked and what didn't. He tried to shift, and she put her hand on his shoulder. "Not hard, just enough." "Don't," she said. "Not yet." He stopped. "Caulfield retreated in the storm. I haven't seen or heard anyone since last night." She met his eyes. "I took down the man who was coming back for you. After you fell." He stared at her. "I told you I had a good eye," she said. He was quiet for a long time. She gave him water, which he drank slowly. She checked the wound, which had held through the night, and looked clean. She fed him a few spoonfuls of the dried jerky she'd softened in water over the fire, which he accepted without protest, which told her more about how weak he still was than anything else would have. By afternoon, he was more alert. He could sit up with support from the rock wall. Though she could see, each breath cost him something. He took stock of the cave, the fire, the supplies laid out with deliberate order, his gelding tied near the entrance, the colt sitting within her reach. He looked at her. He looked at his stitched and wrapped side. He looked at her hands. "All night?" he said. "All night," she said. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at her, the way he sometimes looked at things, steady, and taking it all in, not rushing toward a conclusion. "You didn't have to do this," he said. She met his eyes directly. "Don't insult either of us by saying that." His mouth moved, not quite a smile, but near one. He looked away at the fire and then back. "Thank you, Evie," he said. "Rest," she said. "We're not going anywhere until you can stay on a horse. We have time, and we have shelter, and we have enough food for 2 days." She picked up the colt and checked the cylinder. "I'll watch the entrance." He watched her do this. Something in his face had shifted, something that had been guarded and contained and solitary for a very long time, and she could see it in the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his eyes. When he looked at her, she didn't point it out. "Get some sleep," she told him. "I've got you." After a moment, he let himself lean back against the rock wall and close his eyes. She turned to face the cave entrance and the gray light beyond it, and she watched. He ran a low fever through the second night. Nothing like the first. It came in around midnight, mild enough that she could manage it with the cool cloth and didn't need to panic, and it broke by itself around dawn. When the morning light filled the cave, she checked the wound again, changed the packing, and found it pink and healing with no sign of infection working in. She sat back and let herself feel, for the first time, the hard, clean edge of relief. She fell asleep somewhere around mid-morning. She hadn't meant to. She was sitting against the cave wall, with the colt across her knees, and Bram sleeping 7 feet away, and the fire was low and steady, and the blizzard had stopped, and outside there was just the deep, windless quiet of a Wyoming morning after heavy snow. Her eyes closed, and she didn't fight it, and she was unconscious before she'd fully registered the decision. She woke to find Bram looking at her. He was still lying down, propped up slightly against the rock wall. He'd managed to feed the fire at some point. It was higher than she'd left it. He had his color back, not fully but noticeably, and the glassy fever look was gone from his eyes. He looked tired and sore, and himself. "How long was I out?" she said. 3 hours, maybe." His voice was still rough, but stronger than yesterday. "You needed it." She straightened up, rolled her neck. "Check the cave entrance. Nothing moving out there." The snow outside was undisturbed, bright white and clean under a pale sun that had finally come out. She looked at him. "How do you feel?" "Like I got shot," he said. "That's accurate," she said. He glanced down at his wrapped side and then back at her. "You did good work," he said, "with the stitching. I looked at it this morning. I had good light and steady hands," she said. "And your anatomy was cooperative." He almost laughed. It stopped short when his ribs objected to it, and he pressed his hand against his side and breathed through it. "Don't make yourself laugh," she said. "Not for a few days." Noted. She heated water and made the last of the chamomile tea, and they drank it slowly, on opposite sides of the fire. And the quiet between them was nothing like the silence she'd sit in with other people, where you felt the gap and reached across it. This quiet had weight and warmth to it. She'd been aware of that since the first night in his cabin. It was more present now. After a while, Bram said, "My father was a sheriff." She looked at him. "Cale County," he said. "Good man, straight as they come. He's the reason I took the badge." He was looking at the fire. "He died 3 years before I figured out what Morrison was doing. That was the sheriff I worked under. Corrupt, payrolled, the whole thing. I've thought about that a lot. Whether my father knew, whether he suspected." He was quiet a moment. "I don't think he did, but I'll never know. That's a hard thing to carry," she said. "It put me off people for a while," he said. "If a man like Morrison could fool me that long, I figured my judgment wasn't worth much. Easier to come out here, keep to myself." only answer to the land. She looked at him. Do you think your judgment failed you? Or do you think Morrison was simply very good at deception? He considered it. She had noticed he did that actually considered questions. Didn't just answer with the first thing that came. Both, maybe, he said. Then, you can own your share of it and let the rest sit with him, she said. You don't have to carry the whole weight. She set her mug down. You walked away when you found out. You gave up something that mattered to you because it was the right thing to do. That tells me more about your judgment than the fact that he fooled you. He looked at her across the fire. Your father was a good man, she said. It came out quieter than she'd intended. I could tell from his journal, the way he wrote, the way she stopped. Reset. He was careful about everything. He noticed people. He was kind to the wagon hands, and he wrote their names in the journal and asked after their families. She looked at her tea. When they killed him, he was trying to protect a business so he could take care of me. That was the whole of it. He wasn't a grand man with great ambitions. He just wanted to give his daughter a decent life. She stopped. The fire popped. Bram was quiet for a long time. Then he said, he sounds like a man worth grieving. It was the right thing, exactly the right thing, and she had not expected it. Not sympathy and not comfort and not reassurance. Just acknowledgement, direct and real. She pressed her lips together and nodded once. He is, she said. They sat with that for a while. Later, when the sun had moved and the light in the cave had gone golden and low, Bram shifted and reached out, and she passed him more water, and their hands were close together for a moment around the tin cup. He didn't move his right away, and she didn't either. He was looking at her, not the way men usually looked at her, assessing, calculating, or trying to charm. Just straight and clear, the same way he did most things. You pulled me back from somewhere, he said. Last night, I was somewhere else, and I heard your voice. She held his gaze. You told me I wasn't allowed to die in a cave, he said, and that it wasn't how this ends. She said nothing. I thought, he said slowly. That was probably true, because you said it. Her hand was still close to his on the cup. She didn't think about it. She just turned her hand over and took his, the rough, calloused, enormous hand. And she held it against her cheek for a moment and felt the warmth of it against her skin. A person's worth isn't measured by their physical scars, she said, or the tin badge they wear, or the clothes on their back. She looked at him steadily. You are the kindest, most noble man I have ever met in this wild country. He was very still. She could feel the roughness of his palm, the old scars across his knuckles, all the evidence of a life lived hard and honestly. She held his hand there a moment longer, then lowered it gently and released it. He exhaled slowly. Evie, he said. His voice had gone quiet. I know, she said. He leaned forward, carefully and slow, across the space between them. She didn't move back. She met him there, at the middle of the distance, and when he kissed her, it was nothing like she might have imagined, not the fierce, consuming thing she might have expected from a man built like a force of nature. It was careful and deep and quiet like everything else he did, like a man who understood the weight of things and handled them accordingly. She kissed him back with intention and no hesitation. When they parted, she could see the shift in his face, the thing that had been held back a long time, carefully and alone, now present and visible, and neither of them pretending otherwise. She looked at him clearly. When this is over, she said, when Silas is finished and your name is clean, and my father's journal has done what it needs to do, he understood. When this is over, he agreed. She nodded, sat back, picked up her mug. You need to sleep again, she said, and eat something, and stay still for the rest of today. He settled back against the rock. But he was watching her. You're going to be insufferable when you're a proper frontier woman, he said. You know that. She looked over at him with complete calm. I already am, she said. Rest, Bram. He closed his eyes, but the tension had gone out of his face completely, replaced with something she could only describe as peace. He looked younger in it, closer to the man he might have been before the badge and the betrayal. She turned back to the fire and tended it, And outside the snow lay white and clean, and still in the afternoon light, and the pass was quiet. And for the first time since St. Louis, Evie Sterling felt sure about what came next. Not easy, not safe, but sure, that was enough. Harlan Creek was the kind of town that believed in itself. Main Street ran a full quarter-mile with a proper bank and a telegraph office and a hotel that had glass in all its windows. The storefronts were painted. The boardwalks were even. On Election Day, it dressed itself up further bunting on the railings, a platform built in front of the town hall, a crowd that had been trickling in since early morning from the ranches and homesteads within a day's ride. Bram and Evie came in from the east, through the back streets on horses that had seen better days. Bram rode straight-backed and careful, favoring his left side without being obvious about it. The wound was 2 weeks old and healing well, but it reminded him of itself with any sudden movement. He'd learned to work around it. He'd learned a lot of things in the last 2 weeks. Evie rode beside him with the leather satchel across her lap, one hand resting on it, and she was watching the town with those dark, observant eyes that missed nothing. "The platform," she said quietly, nodding toward the town hall. "Silas will speak from there," he always liked to stage. "How long have you known him?" "My whole life," she said. "He came to Sunday dinners when I was small. He used to bring me hard candy from the city and call me his favorite niece." She paused. "I was his only niece." Bram said nothing. He was scanning the street, identifying Silas's men, 3 of them visible near the platform, dressed too well for ranch hands and standing too still for casual bystanders. One more, near the hotel entrance. Another by the telegraph office. Caulfield wasn't among them. He'd sent word through a contact in the next county that Red Jack had crossed into Colorado after the pass, running from the bounty Bram had filed. That was one problem off the board, at least for now. "Dodd's here," Bram said, spotting the sheriff's horse tied in front of the jail. "He'll move when things start." "Let him move," Evie said. "I only need 2 minutes on that platform." He looked at her. 2 minutes. "My father argued his first commercial case in 4, she said. "I'm more motivated than he was." They split up at the end of the block. Bram circled around the back of the town hall to get in close to the platform from the side, where he could see Silas's men, and they couldn't easily see him. Evie went around to the crowd. Anonymous in a plain brown coat and a wide-brimmed hat borrowed from the wife of the rancher, who'd sheltered them 3 nights back. She walked into the crowd and became part of it and waited. Judge Silas Sterling took the stage at noon. He was a handsome man, Bram noted from his position at the corner of the building. Tall, silver-haired, with a statesman's bearing and a voice built for carrying across open ground. He wore a black coat and a silver watch chain, and he smiled at the crowd the way a man smiles when he is absolutely certain of his welcome. Speak. Land and prosperity, the rule of law, the future of Harlan County, under stable, experienced leadership. He was good at it. Bram could see people nodding. He was about 3 minutes in when Evie stepped out of the crowd and walked up the platform steps. One of Silas's men near the stairs moved to intercept. Evie went around him with the calm efficiency of someone who had already accounted for that obstacle and kept walking. She walked across the platform and stood beside Silas, and she was 19 years old in a borrowed coat, and she looked like she owned the ground she was standing on. Silas stopped mid-sentence. His expression went through several things, very quickly: confusion, recognition, then something cold and calculated that he almost managed to hide before his face settled into a performance of shock and relief. "Genevieve," he started. "My name is Genevieve Sterling," she said, turning to face the crowd. Her voice carried clean and clear in the cold air. "I am the daughter of Arthur Sterling, who was murdered 3 weeks ago on the Harlan Road, along with 4 hired hands." She paused, letting that sit. The attack was reported in the county papers as a Shoshone raid. It was not. The crowd had gone still. Silas put his hand on her arm. "My dear, you've been through a terrible ordeal." She stepped away from his hand and faced him, and anyone watching from the crowd could see it exactly, his hand reaching, her deliberate step away, the distance she put between them measured and precise. The attack, she said, still addressing the crowd, was carried out by the Caulfield gang, under contract. I witnessed it. I heard the men speaking. I have my father's journal, dated and signed, documenting the negotiations, the payment, and the identity of the man who arranged it. She opened the satchel and drew out the journal and held it up. These documents have already been copied, and the copies delivered to the federal marshal's office in Cheyenne by telegraph. She looked directly at Silas. Destroying this copy accomplishes nothing. Silas had gone completely still. The performance was gone. What was under it was exactly what Bram had expected from reading the journal, a sharp, ruthless man who had just watched his plan dissolve in public and was calculating his remaining options. His hand moved toward the guard nearest the platform. Bram stepped out from the corner of the building. He didn't draw, he didn't shout. He just walked forward through the edge of the crowd, all 6.5 feet of him, and he stopped at the base of the platform steps with his hand resting on his holster. And he looked up at Silas's guard with an expression that communicated clearly and without words that drawing was a choice with very specific consequences. The guard looked at him for 3 seconds. Then he took his hand away from his weapon. The second guard, by the other side of the platform, looked at the crowd around him, a crowd that had been listening to Evie Sterling for the last 2 minutes, a crowd whose mood had shifted in the visible, palpable way that crowds shift when they feel they've been lied to, and he made the same calculation and reached the same conclusion. The journal documents payments, made through a land holding company registered in Silas Sterling's name, Evie continued. It documents correspondence between my uncle and Jack Caulfield's intermediary across a period of 8 months. It documents my father's growing suspicion, his attempts to verify what he feared, and his conclusion, written in his own hand the night before he was killed. She looked at the crowd. Her voice stayed steady. My father spent 30 years building an honest life. He was murdered for a land deed, and the man who ordered it has been standing in front of you today asking for your vote. The silence in the crowd broke all at once, the way silences do when they've been held too long into voices and movement, and a specific rising anger that has no single source. Sheriff Dodd came out of the jail at a near run. He got halfway across the street, saw the crowd, saw Bram at the base of the platform steps, and stopped. Bram looked at him across the distance. Calm and direct, Dodd looked at the crowd. He looked at Evie on the platform with the journal in her hand, and the faces of the townspeople turned toward her. He looked at Silas, whose composure had finally cracked, who was speaking rapidly and quietly to the one remaining guard in a way that communicated panic to anyone with eyes. Dodd stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the street for a long moment. Then he turned around and went back to his office. 3 of the town's prominent men, the banker, the newspaper editor, and the land registry clerk had pushed their way to the front of the crowd. The banker was already calling for Silas to step down from the platform. The newspaper editor had his note out. It took another 20 minutes, and the arrival of 2 of Dodd's deputies, who had apparently decided their own interests, were better served by positioning themselves on the right side of the day's events. But when the crowd escorted Silas Sterling down from the platform and into custody to await the federal marshal, it was done with the particular moral authority of a community that had made the decision itself. Nobody fired a shot. Evie came down the platform steps and crossed to where Bram was standing. She stopped beside him and looked at the scene in front of them, Silas being walked firmly through the crowd, the journal already in the banker's hands. The newspaper editor writing at a pace that suggested he was going to have strong opinions in tomorrow's edition. 2 minutes, Bram said. 2 minutes and 40 seconds, she said. I went slightly over. He looked down at her. She was watching the crowd, her chin up, her face composed. But he could see at the edges of it the cost of what she'd just done. The effort of standing on that platform above the man who'd ordered her family killed, and speaking clearly, and not breaking. Your father would have been proud, he said. She looked at him. Her eyes were bright. She pressed her lips together once and nodded. Then she squared her shoulders and went to give her full statement to the newspaper editor. And Bram stood back and let her, because that was exactly what she needed to do and exactly what he would have expected of her. They went back to the valley in early spring. The cabin was as they'd left it, which was to say cold and dark and in need of attention. 3 of the windows needed recalking. A section of the porch railing had come down under winter snow. The woodpile was low. The garden plot behind the cabin was last year's frozen stubble. Bram walked through it and made a list in his head. Evie walked through it and made a different list. When they compared them that evening over a fire they'd built in the hearth, the lists were different but complementary, which struck them both, separately as apt. They rebuilt it together. That was not a figure of speech. Evie mixed mortar and handed it up, while Bram recalked the stone chimney from a ladder. Bram hauled timber, while Evie measured and marked cuts with a precision that made him stop and look at her twice. They fell into a working rhythm that required very little speech, a look, a nod, a hand extended. The cabin took shape around them over the course of 3 weeks, larger than it had been, better, a second room. Proper shelving, a real porch with a repaired rail, and 2 chairs set side by side. The legal business had taken time, but it had resolved. The federal marshal out of Cheyenne had been thorough and unhurried and deeply unimpressed with Silas Sterling's attorney, who had tried several increasingly creative arguments over the course of the proceedings. The journal had done its work. Silas was awaiting trial. Evie's inheritance, the silver deeds, the land. Her father's business accounts had been placed in trust, pending the court's final ruling, and the ruling was expected to go cleanly. Red Jack Caulfield was still in Colorado. Bram had 2 contacts watching for him. That was a thread left to pull, but it would keep. Tonight was not for threads left to pull. It was the second full moon of their time in the valley. Exactly 1 year to the night since Bram had stepped out of a Wyoming pine forest and found her collapsed in the snow. He didn't mention it. She did 1 year ago tonight, she said. They were on the porch in the cool spring dark. The valley spread out below them, the moon riding high and full and white above the ridgeline. You gave me your coat. You needed it more than I did, he said. You closed your eyes, she said, before you gave it to me. Do you remember that? I remember. She turned to look at him. I've thought about that a lot, she said, in the years since. It was such a small thing. 2 seconds, eyes closed, coat off. But it was the first moment in days that I felt. She paused, finding the word, seen, like a person, not a problem to be managed or a body to be threatened. He was looking at her. The moonlight caught the scar along his jaw. You were always a person, he said. That's not something I did. That's something you are. She held his gaze. Then she stood up from her chair, deliberate and clear-eyed, and she crossed the 2 steps between them, and she took his face in both her hands. He went very still. Genevieve, he said. Lo, I know what I'm doing, she said, and I know what I want. And I've known both of those things for quite some time. She looked at him steadily. I am telling you clearly, and I am not afraid. He looked at her for a long moment. His hands came up and covered hers, enormous and warm. I love you, he said. He said it plain, the way he said things that mattered. No performance in it. I've loved you since you stepped in front of that sheriff's gun and told him to explain himself to a federal judge. She smiled. It was a real one, full and unguarded. I love you too? Since the cave, I think, when you told me I wasn't allowed to make you laugh. He stood. He was so much larger than her, and so remarkably careful about it. Always had been tilting toward her without crowding, letting her set the distance. She closed it herself. He kissed her, the way he did most things, with his full attention and no waste motion. One hand cradling the back of her head with a gentleness that had no business existing in hands that size. She kissed him back, and she had no hesitation in her, and no fear, only the clear, bright certainty of choosing something wholeheartedly. He lifted her, easy and careful, and carried her inside the way he'd carried her through a Wyoming pine forest 1 year ago, like something he intended to protect. And this time, she wasn't afraid, and she wasn't cold, and she wasn't anything but exactly where she meant to be. Inside, the fire was low and warm, throwing amber light across the new pine walls. He set her down gently and looked at her face, and she looked back at his, the scar and the dark eyes and the rough jaw. And she thought that she had never in her life seen anything so beautiful as this man who had given her his coat first and asked nothing after. She reached up and touched the scar along his jaw with her fingertips. He turned his face slightly into her hand. What followed was not urgent. It had no need to be. They had survived a mountain pass and a corrupt judge and a Wyoming winter, and urgency had been used up on all of that. What was left was something slower and more thorough, two people, learning each other with the careful, complete attention they had always given each other in a warm room with a fire going and a full moon outside and all the time in the world. He was extraordinary in his gentleness. She had expected it, and it still moved her. He learned what she wanted, and he gave it without reservation, and she was confident and present, and gave back in equal measure, and it was nothing like the cold transaction she had once. As a frightened girl in a pine forest begged to be spared from, it was the opposite of that. It was its own complete thing, warm and mutual and freely chosen, a celebration in the truest sense of survival and trust, and two people who had come through fire together and built something out of what was left. Afterward, she lay with her head against his chest, his arm around her, the fire burning down to coals. "We need more firewood," she said. He laughed, low and careful of his ribs. The scar on his side had healed clean, but still sang in cold weather. "In the morning," he said. "In the morning," she agreed. The moon moved across the window. Outside, the valley was silver and still. 3 years later, the Vance Ranch had a name, Sterling Ridge. Evie had named it after her father, and Bram had painted the sign himself, with the careful, deliberate hand of a man who understood that certain things deserved to be done right. The sign hung over the main gate, which now stood at the head of a proper road leading up from the valley floor. The cabin was unrecognizable, in the best sense. It had grown outward in stages, as need and resources allowed a long bunkhouse to the east, a stable for 8 horses, a proper barn with a hay loft, a root cellar, a smithing shed. The garden behind the main house covered a full acre now, and was managed with fierce efficiency by a bohemian woman named Marta, who had arrived 2 springs ago, with 4 children, no husband, and a determination to work that had impressed even Bram. Marta was not the only one. Sterling Ridge had become something that neither Bram nor Evie had precisely planned, though if you knew them well, you would say it was inevitable. It was a place that found people. An Irish family of 6 who had lost their homestead to a land company's paperwork. 2 freed men from Missouri, looking for ground to work that was their own. A young Shoshone woman named Pale River, who had been displaced from her band and needed winter shelter, and had stayed because Evie had asked her to teach the children her language, and she had found, to her evident surprise, that she wanted to. Pale River was now Evie's closest friend and had opinions about everything, which Evie appreciated enormously. On a morning in late September, with the aspens turned gold on the ridges and the sky that deep Wyoming blue that only came in the weeks between summer heat and winter cold, Evie stood at the door of the schoolhouse and watched her students arrive. 11 of them this year, Marta's 4, 2 of the Irish children, the freedmen's boy and girl, 3 others from neighboring homesteads, whose parents had started sending them over in the spring, after word had spread that there was a real schoolhouse in the valley, with a real teacher who expected real work. She'd built the curriculum herself, over a winter working by firelight, reading and writing and arithmetic, the foundations, history, including the kinds of history that didn't make it into the official school books, the full account of what had happened to the land before the settlers came, taught with Pale River's help and perspective. Practical science. Debate. The girls sat in the same chairs as the boys and were called on with the same frequency and were expected to defend their answers with the same rigor. Evie had been told by a circuit preacher passing through in the summer that her methods were unconventional. She had told him, politely and clearly, that she would take that as a compliment. Across the yard, Bram was at the corral with the older young men, 3 of them today, working with a pair of young horses that needed handling. He taught them everything: horsemanship and fence work and smithing and tracking and how to read weather and how to treat an injury in the field. He taught the young women the same things when they wanted to learn, which most of them did, because Bram Vance had never in his life drawn a line between what a woman could or couldn't learn to do. He taught them the Cowboy Code, the way his father had taught him, not as a list of rules, but as a way of looking at the world. You protect those who need protecting. You don't bully the weak. You respect the land because it will outlast you. You respect people because they deserve it, not because they've earned it yet. The young men listened. They watched how he treated Evie and how he treated the women on the ranch and how he treated the land itself, and they learned more from watching than from anything he said directly. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. Red Jack Caulfield had been brought in the previous winter by Bram and a federal marshal working together, without fanfare. He was awaiting trial in Cheyenne. Silas Sterling had been convicted the year before and was serving his sentence in the territorial prison. Evie had attended the sentencing and had not felt triumphant. She had felt complete, which was different and more durable. Sheriff Dodd had quietly resigned and moved to another county. Nobody had been particularly surprised. In the afternoon, when the school day was done and the children had gone home, Evie walked out to the hill above the ranch and sat in the grass and looked at the valley below. It was a habit she'd developed in the first year, this sitting and looking. Taking stock, she heard Bram's boots in the grass behind her and felt him settle down beside her, close enough that his shoulder was warm against hers. They sat and they looked at what they'd built. The ranch in the late afternoon light, the smoke from the cookhouse rising straight up into the still air, the horses moving in the lower pasture, the yellow leaves catching the sun on the ridge above. Marta's youngest running across the yard below after a chicken that had escaped its pen. Pale River sitting on the bunkhouse steps with 2 of the older girls, teaching them something, her hands moving as she talked. Bram put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side. Pale River's teaching them to read the sky for weather, she said. She says we'll have snow by the end of next week. She's not wrong, he said. She was quiet for a moment. We need another room on the schoolhouse before winter. I know, and more books. I wrote to the St. Louis Library 2 weeks ago. I know that, too, he said. She looked up at him. His face in the afternoon light, the scar and the quiet eyes and the deep, steady presence of him that she had come to understand was simply what he was, all the way through. We've built something real, she said. He looked at the valley, then back at her. We have, he said. She settled back against his shoulder and looked at their valley, green and gold in the September light, full of people who had come from broken places and found ground to stand on, full of children who were learning that the world was larger than what had hurt them, and that their minds were tools and their voices mattered, and that the person sitting next to them in the schoolroom deserved the same chance they did. Full of everything 2 people could build when they chose each other clearly and built on what was honest. The sun dropped toward the ridge. The smoke rose. Below them, the ranch moved with the quiet, purposeful activity of people who had somewhere real to be. Bram pressed his lips to the top of her head, once and without ceremony. She closed her eyes. In the heart of the Wild West, on a hill above a green valley, in the last gold light of a September afternoon, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. And that's the story of Bramwell Vance and Genevieve Sterling, a giant cowboy who closed his eyes in the dark so a terrified girl could feel safe. A 19-year-old who cut herself free with a rock dragged a 250-pound man across an icy mountain path and stitched him back together by firelight alone, in a blizzard, with nothing but steady hands and sheer will. Two broken people who found each other in the worst possible circumstances and chose, every single day after that, to build something honest out of what was left. But here's what I want you to take away from this story, because it's more than just a romance set in the Wild West. The moment Bram closed his eyes and handed Evie his coat, he wasn't performing chivalry. He wasn't calculating what he'd get in return. He simply understood one thing, down to his bones, that her body, her dignity, and her choices belonged to her, and that no amount of fear, power, or darkness gave anyone the right to take those things away. He said it plainly, without ceremony. A free woman has absolute autonomy over her own body. Not because the law said so, not because anyone was watching, because it was true. That kind of decency isn't old-fashioned. It isn't fictional. It's the standard every human being deserves to be treated by, and the standard every one of us is capable of holding ourselves to, if we choose it. And then there's Evie. She arrived in this story as a victim of violence, stripped of everything: her family, her safety, her clothes, her future. Every conventional story would have kept her there, waiting to be rescued, grateful and passive, and defined entirely by what had been done to her. Evie refused that. She demanded to learn to shoot. She stepped in front of a sheriff's gun to defend the man who'd helped her. She performed surgery by firelight. She walked onto a public stage and dismantled a corrupt judge with nothing but truth and a dead man's journal. She didn't survive this story. She drove it. And that distinction matters more than I can say, because the world is full of people who have been knocked flat by circumstances they didn't choose. And what Evie shows us is that being a victim of something is never the final word on who you are. What you do next is what Bram and Evie built at Sterling Ridge, that ranch full of immigrants and orphans and displaced people and children learning in equal chairs. That wasn't an accident. It was the natural result of two people who genuinely believed that every human being, regardless of where they came from or what they'd lost, deserved ground to stand on and a chance to grow. They didn't build a legacy by accumulating power. They built it by giving opportunity away, freely and without condition. And that, more than any gunfight or courtroom drama, is the most radical thing in this entire story. So, if you take nothing else from Bram and Evie's journey, take this. Dignity is not something that gets handed to you by the right circumstances or the right person. It's something you claim and something you protect in others, every time you get the chance. A close pair of eyes in the dark, a step forward instead of back. A voice that tells the truth when it would be so much easier to stay quiet. Those are the things that change lives. Those are the things that build something real. This story is a work of fiction created purely for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and locations are entirely imaginary, and any resemblance to real persons or actual events is coincidental.